Hi, hello all. This vlog is going to be about some of the research I've done recently. Now, about a week ago, I posted about the Birr Workhouse, or as the area used to be called, Parsonstown. So there was a workhouse in Parsonstown, and there was a deaf inmate in the workhouse who was there for many years. And I wanted to give a little bit more information about this particular guy and why he's so interesting to me. And there's a number of reasons for that. First off, I had already found out about quite a few deaf people who had been inmates of workhouses for several years around the country. But this particular guy, John Neville, both lived and worked in the workhouse. And that's a bit different to the previous cases I've found. The body in charge of the workhouse, the Board of Guardians, looked upon John as a good guy, trustworthy. They thought he was a good worker, and they gave him lots of different work to do. So really he was employed by the workhouse. That's quite rare. I hadn't seen that before with other deaf inmates. I mean, other inmates have been given odd jobs to do, the odd time, but they'd never had not necessarily a permanent job, but they'd never been employed in that sense by the workhouse before. So I found that was one reason why this case was so interesting. Also, just the sheer amount of information over such a long period of time that I'd found out. So from the 1880s all the way up to, I would say, 1921 when John died. And I've looked for his death certificate and I can't find that yet, unfortunately. That's really frustrating me. But he died in 1921. The local newspaper would have printed a small piece around the fact that John Neville had died, the fact that he was well known locally. And they mentioned that he worked for the workhouse as a clerical worker, which is funny because I'd found references previous to that of John working as a messenger for the workhouse, that kind of work, bringing supplies to and from the workhouse. So there's lots of reference to that kind of work, but nothing referring to clerical work. So to employ a deaf person as a clerical worker of some kind in the workhouse, again, would have been a first. But the information I've gathered about John Neville to date is particularly rich and detailed. And going forward, I will show some examples. He wrote poetry. He would have written to the workhouse guardians at one stage as well to talk about a neighbouring workhouse in the town of Roscrea. And John Neville at one stage wrote to the Birr Workhouse guardians asking could a deaf person who was in Roscrea Workhouse be brought to the Birr Workhouse for company. Now obviously he was worried that that deaf person in Roscrea was there for a long time on his own and wanted that deaf person to be brought to Birr Workhouse so they could sign together and he could have company. But the guardians rejected that outright. They didn't really take that seriously at all. So, I mean, there's lots of different pieces of information and articles I found about John in that regard. Also, it's interesting when we talk about his mother. Now, I had said before that there was talk around the town that his mother had been killed in a train crash. And a newspaper at one stage said that there was a rumour or some sort of story that had been passed down that actually his mother had died with her child in her arms, and that child grew up to be John Neville. And John Neville was then sent to a deaf school. Now, I've tried to do some research around this, and I found this story has been exaggerated or has been changed around a bit. Really, his mother did seem to die from a train crash, but it was a year previous to this. Now, his mother died in 1870 from the train crash, but in 1869, John himself was sent to Dublin, to Cabra, St Joseph's School for the Deaf. So that was a year before his mother died. So it looks like his mother also was described as an itinerant, which looks like she was a member of the travelling community. So itinerant was a word used at that time to describe a member of the travelling community. But The mother, Mary, or Molly, as she was also known, Molly Neville, was deaf. That was a real shock for me to find out. But it looks like definitely she was deaf, and she had a son named John. And it looks like John was the child that was sent to the deaf school. There are some gaps in the historical records that we're not clear of, so I'm continuing to do research. So for these reasons, I'm really interested in the story of John Neville. The fact that he had a deaf mother maybe was of benefit to John before he was sent to deaf school, because they could sign together. Now, it looks like Mary Neville, his mother, was never sent to a deaf school, but maybe they had a home sign or some sort of signing system between each other that helped them bond, and that was advantageous to John and maybe helped him to become very intelligent in later life. So the information is really rich around John Neville's life. So anyway, there's all these different reasons, but I just wanted to update you a little bit about what I found out about John Neville, and to let you know as well that I'm going to travel to the Offaly County Archives and try and do a little bit more in-depth research. And there's going to be part 2 of this vlog also that I'm going to add soon. So here's part 2. Over the last 2 weeks, I've been doing a lot of research about John Neville, who was a deaf man who lived in the Birr Workhouse, Birr, or as it was called many years ago, Parsonstown Workhouse. So in the course of the research, I find out something that's quite personal, a personal connection that I have with John Neville's story. I'll explain what that is. Let's leave John Neville himself aside for a moment. I'll talk about my own family. The connection comes on my father's side. My father's mother was from County Laois, and her father, my great-grandfather, was a man from Kilkenny. Whereabouts in Kilkenny? Yes, it was the town of Castlecomer. When I was growing up, I had found out that this great-grandfather had been blind, and the story of how he became blind is as follows. So my great-grandfather, whose name is John Brennan, worked as a labourer, and he would have done a job digging wells. So he would have dug a well shaft, digging all the way down to the source of the water, and then it would have come up and formed a well. Sometimes the rock underneath the digging was quite hard, and you would have to lay a dynamite charge to blow through this rock. Now, obviously, after you've exited the mine shaft yourself, to blow a hole in this bedrock. So at one stage, my great-grandfather would have laid a charge of dynamite. The fuse was burning down. He would have exited the shaft, but didn't hear any explosion. So he went back in to examine the charge, and it exploded in his face, doing serious damage to his eyes and to his hands. It was really terrible, and at the time, he was already married. He had 4 children, but his hands now were so damaged he only had limited use of them. He had no eyesight left, and it was very hard for blind people, just as deaf people, to get along in life and to gain employment. So after the explosion, what happened was that my great-grandfather was brought to the local workhouse hospital for treatment. After that treatment was finished, he was sent to Dublin, to the City of Dublin Hospital, for more treatment. And what ended up happening was John was trained in basket making. So that was a skill that you didn't need to have eyesight for. Once he was trained in this, he returned to this area of County Laois, and his life was very successful. He became a basket maker. He had about 11 or 12 children in total. You know, he had a good life. But when this happened, when the explosion happened in the mine shaft, he was brought to the workhouse hospital. But this particular workhouse was Birr Workhouse. And because John Brennan was working away from home, he was working away from his home of Portlaoise, the explosion happened at a distance from his home area, so he had to be brought to the local workhouse hospital, which was in Birr. And this was around the time that John Neville was working in the workhouse. So it's very possible that he met my great-grandfather, or maybe even helped to look after him, maybe even just shook his hand or had some kind of contact with my great-grandfather. I mean, I've no idea, but it does make me a bit more intrigued, and makes me want to do a little bit more research into John Neville's life. So that's just a bit of extra information about John Neville that I wanted to share with you. And hopefully I'll have more information to give you all soon about John Neville. All right, bye.